just want to tell you one thing. So sometimes people call you Dr. Jacobs. You've heard that, right?
Yeah.
And I say, there's only one Walter Jacob. There can only be ever one. So that's how you remember it's Jacob.
One is probably more than enough. Oh, yeah. Well, we're going to keep this informal. And you have, after all, heard some excellent sermons. And I'm certainly not going to try to compete with my younger colleagues. They are doing beautifully, and it's been interesting in two ways. One is, when I sit back there, it depends on who's speaking and how they are wired up. So that there are times when I have to guess what I think they might have said. But in these last 2 days, it's been much better for me because I have seated myself up here occasionally and said to myself, well, they broadcast this, so I should probably have stayed home and I would have had the sermon. Or in this case, or in that particular case, I had to say to myself, all right, that's one of the advantages, one of the paths of progress which has been made, that if you are a few feet away, but behind the speaker, you're not able to hear anything. So, to express gratitude for that, or not? But fortunately, in most instances here, and certainly on this day, yesterday, and today, I was able to hear the sermons and am grateful for what they expressed and also how they expressed it. You have had plenty of sermons, so I've decided certainly not to add to that. Rather to spend a bit of time together, informally, talking about my main project for the last years, not the botanical garden. That remains an important project, of course. But there, all I have to do is applaud because it's run so beautifully. But to speak to you about the other project, which I spent a lot of time on, not only in the last few years, but before that, the Abraham Geiger College. What has happened? Why does it exist? And what do we expect from it? Because in a way, it's sort of ironic. In the last few months, the Cincinnati campus of the Hebrew Union College has closed. It took it a long time to close because there were an awful lot of people that had to be pleased, talked to, thanked for what they had done and what they had not done. And it was a closing with a lot of side comments, and I'm glad that at the same time as it closed, Cincinnati is a good place, was a good place for the Hebrew Union College to start, but it took it a long time to realize that Cincinnati is an important city, but even in the United States, it does not reckon as one of the important cities of the country. It's a city, okay. So it took it a while, and interestingly enough, at the same time as it closed, we opened. Why did we go that way? Why didn't we just take Cincinnati for the Geiger College and adopt that and continue? Well, the paths are so different, and it's difficult for us, perhaps, to understand that what the Geiger College, which is now in its 10th year or so, has done is not only helped us as a group of Jews, but has become a presence of Jewish studies in Berlin and in Potsdam, Berlin. Because what we have done is said to ourselves, we have begun, and with considerable effort and help on everybody's part, have established a seminary and everything else connected with it in Germany. Who would have expected that? That there would be a major school of Jewish studies at the University of Potsdam, right in the heart of Berlin. After all, what we have been through with Germany, that's the last thing anybody would have been able to predict. And it has happened. And it has happened not without problems. But the problems have not come from the Germans. The Germans have been extremely helpful in every conceivable way. Well, what was the problem? What are the problems? The problems have been the Jewish organizations. You don't know how difficult it is to work with a series of Jewish organizations. Each of them feels that it is the organization, and the others really don't count. But what one has to have in order to do that is mainly a great deal of chutzpah. You have to be able to say to them, and say it again and again and again, and say, we are establishing something in Germany for Germans or for the surrounding countries. But it has no bearing at all on what you're continuing to do in the United States or in the neighboring countries. And it does not mean that we no longer appreciate the Union of American Hebrew Congregations. We do, or the conservative movements, strong efforts. We appreciate them too. But please, when you look at us, think of us as something new. And we don't want to lean on either the conservatives or the reforms or the reconstructionists. We're happy to accept their money, but we don't want to accept their leadership all alone. And that continues to be a major effort for us. It's kind of interesting. We are not fighting with the German government. They're very generous. We're not fighting with the conservative movement. They also are generous, but they want to be dominant. And there we have said, no, we're establishing something in Germany which is to deal with the present situation as it exists in Germany, and has nothing to do with whatever you are doing elsewhere in the world. So that's been our effort, and it's taken a considerable amount of effort, not so much to establish an organization. That's always possible among us. You know that. If somebody wants to establish a new synagogue, they don't have to ask anybody's permission. They just do it. And if they've done it right, it works. If they have not done it right, it fails. But it can be done so easily among us. So what we have done and continue to do is in Germany establish a place and a school which is part of the University of Potsdam, is their Jewish department. They run it almost completely, and we simply live with their decisions. They are their decisions. They are not American decisions, and they are not New York decisions. It's been an interesting adventure, and it can only be, I think, semi-successfully done by somebody who's willing to say, I know you are the head of a huge enterprise in the United States, and I'm happy to accept your donations. But please don't try to run us. We're going to run ourselves. So what do we do? How do we train rabbis for Central Europe? It would be very simple to just send them to Los Angeles or to New York, where all of these institutions with which we're familiar, Reform and Conservative, work, and move in that direction. We only have handfuls of students, but those handful of students cannot be trained by an American institution because our problems are completely different. Our approach is completely different. And by asking our students, which we could have done, to simply go to New York or go to Los Angeles, we have only imposed a major effort of German and German speaking upon them. We don't really need that. Who are these students? They're a very interesting group. Let me give you two examples. The first is a family that has been Russian Jewish for I don't know how long, a couple of centuries. Probably not, because they were persecuted a few times in between. So let's make it a little less. but it was a purely Russian institution. And this institution was moved when the German military advanced further and further. So they were once on the outskirts of Moscow. Now they are 500 miles inland. How did they do that? Well, they did it very simply, as any authoritarian government will do. They said, look, we're going to move you. You don't want to move? That's not a choice. We're going to move you. So we moved them to a small place in central Russia. And the young man whom I'm going to describe in a moment was born there. With any Jewish background in the neighborhood? No. With a synagogue anywhere in the neighborhood? Not within 500 miles. So they lived there. They had a good life there, but nothing on the outside, nothing Jewish at all. But this man insisted, as he was growing up, and his parents insisted, that they make him as Jewish as possible. Well, you know, they were good people, but they certainly were not a learned group. This wasn't a group that you would normally leave to educate anybody in Judaism. The man knew he was Jewish. And they had the simple ceremonies that we all have on Shabbat and on holidays. And when he asked further questions about them, they had no answers. But he was Jewish, and he decided to make something of it. So as he grew up, he ran into other people who were Jewish, who educated him a little bit. Well, you know, how much education would you get from your children to teach somebody about Judaism in a major way? But despite that difficulty, he became a decent Jew, and then decided all of a sudden that what he wanted to do was be a rabbi. His parents blinked a few times. How in the world did that come? And tried hard to dissuade him. But he decided, no, he wanted to become a rabbi. So he ended up applying to us. He didn't want to become an Orthodox rabbi, he wanted to become a more liberal rabbi. So now where do we begin to teach him? There's no school you can really send him to. If we had sent him to the New York or Cincinnati School of the Reform Movement, they would have said, look, we've got a young man here who really needs to go to kindergarten, not to any advanced program. But this man was very persistent, and he indicated, and we said, okay, we understand you. You want to do something for the Jewish people. And we will enroll you in the school that we now have. But most of the things that we would normally teach you, we won't teach you. We will begin with the basics and simply think of you as a person who is not Jewish and who wants to learn something about Judaism. And he pursued that for a couple of years, pursued it very, very seriously. And then we were able to say to him, okay, you can join our small group which is preparing to become rabbis. The other people didn't have much better background than he. Most of them had very, very limited background, but were willing to study, and that was good enough for us. So this is one of our students who is now in his second year, you might say. We don't really have a kind of a program that's big enough to have a whole class. This class consists of 2 people, and we are trying to teach those 2 so that they can become teachers beyond that. It's a strange way to move ahead, but we really don't have any choice, because the people that we see from Eastern Europe either have no background and have no way of getting any background, or they are completely on their own. So what we've done with this young man and with others like him is say, we're going to have a rabbinic studies which is going to be one-on-one. You're going to be learning from somebody that we happen to have in Berlin, or when we need something beyond that, we'll give you somebody who is an expert in a field of Jewish law. Well, where is that person? Well, that person happens to be at this point in Pittsburgh. So how are we going to get together? We're not going to get together. We're going to do this completely by the internet and by the computer. And so we've taken, in the last dozen years, perhaps a little more than that, a whole series of people like that we would say, well, you are university trained already, but not in Jewish studies or even other general studies that are close to Jewish studies. And we will get you to the point where we will be able to say, you know enough to become a rabbi. How long does that take? In most of these cases, it's taken 4 or 5 years of highly individualized studies, each one really tailor-made for the individual. That sounds like a crazy way to go at it, but we don't have any real choice. The number of people involved is so small, you can't set up a whole program. So we've done that, and it has worked amazingly well, and I'm really the troubleshooter for that program. Because what happens is the young man like this, now filled with a fair amount of knowledge and able to say, I know enough about Judaism, I know enough about the rabbinate, I know enough about Jewish law to be able to function in that capacity. But of course, it becomes difficult for a very simple reason. Any congregation that we send them to doesn't matter where it is or who it is, has a president. The president is not a well-civilized individual like the president of this congregation, who has worked with organizations a long time. The president now sees the rabbi whom we have suggested for him, for that congregation, and they have said, all right, we'll try it. And so they do. What ends up as a result? An enormous amount of energy spent between the president and the new rabbi as to who really has the last word. That's a difficult matter. It's a difficult matter even in American congregations, which are accustomed to this happening all the time. So this young man now, what does he do? He does two things. One, he calls on his own previous experience. Most of our students came to us from success in some other field and have worked with groups before, so they all have that kind of a background and can sort of listen to the president of the congregation and can say yes, 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 no, yes, yeah, we've got a few other things we can agree on, let's work on those and forget about those that we don't agree on. Those are the situations which we find ourselves with our new rabbis. They are usually not a group, maybe two, maybe three, maybe just one in a year. And they begin to function largely by talking a great deal to each other. So, and then when they run out of good answers there, calling me in Pittsburgh and saying, what can you do? How can you help us? What should we do? And it inevitably works out well. It may be time-consuming, and it may be aggravating at times. For me, that is. Probably for them, too. But that's the way we have begun to build up, surprisingly enough, in Potsdam, at the University of Berlin, a Jewish studies program which has two major functions. One is to train rabbis for the Central European congregations, who could also, of course, turn to Americans. The problem with Americans is, one, most of them are unwilling to learn another language, at least learn another language sufficiently so that you can function in it. That's a major problem. And the other problem is that after a year or two in which they see this as a wonderful adventure, all sorts of new thoughts come to them. But after 2 years or 3 years, they wonder if there isn't a nice congregation in the United States that would like them. So they come back to the United States. And what has happened to us? We have just lost a rabbi. In the United States, where we probably have, 400 Reform rabbis, one more, one less, doesn't make any great difference. But there, we are suddenly back at point zero. So our efforts, which for a while were quite willing to accept Americans or anybody else, we now tend to say, don't you think you'd be better off in Massachusetts or in New York or in Missouri or even in Montana to trying to be out here? So the effort that we make now is completely centralized on training European rabbis in Europe. And that's not so easy either, because the Jews who are Central European Jews, whether it's Germany or Czechoslovakia or any of the native countries, they're really not native to those countries. They are originally Russians, and they are Russian Jews. How come they are there in this situation? Well, the Russian government was willing to allow Jews to leave and to settle somewhere else. And so we have these German Jewish communities in which the president will probably speak a good broken German and will be much more at home in Russian or Polish or something else like that. So our efforts in Europe are first of all to train rabbis to function in these widely scattered communities all across Germany. And then to try to begin to work with the Jewish community, such as it is, to form the sorts of things to which we are totally accustomed. We don't even think twice about a little congregation off in the hills here functioning well. Of course they'll function well. They're trained to function in that sort of a situation because that's what they live with in the public school system. They just transfer those skills back to their own school system. So what we've done in the last, after some mistakes made on our part, is to establish our own system and to have people not go to America or England. They can go, but we'll warn them that may not work out so well. Use our simple system and work out the problems that you have in your congregation, and don't try to fool with the folks in either New York or in London. It's best for you to say, we thank you for your wish to help us, and we will of course accept your money. But beyond that, just leave us alone. We will function, and we will function quite well. So what we've done, what I've been heavily involved with up to this year, I find that government regulations don't work so well with somebody who is up in years and is unwilling to do major changes. But we now have about 60 rabbis who are functioning either in Germany or in any of the other native countries nearby. And that has worked out well. they have a functioning conference and are able to represent Jews not only in Germany, but also in Italy, in the Czech Republic, in Hungary, and so on. And that works out very nicely for us. It's not been easy. It's always been interesting. And we are lucky that we're able to function in that way. So I wanted to give you a little bit of an insight into what we do to train rabbis for these countries. We can train them here, but that's usually unsuccessful. So we go at it in this way, and that seems to work out quite well for us. Any thoughts or questions or discussions? Yes.
So what made you decide to do this in the first place? I mean, what was your initial thoughts? Why you wanted to start about it?
Why did we need to start it? Because we needed rabbis. And we knew that the rabbis that we train in any of our American schools are basically not going to be able to function, primarily because they are either unwilling or unable to learn another language, and to learn another language really well. It's frustrating. We went down that road, first of all, but found the frustrations too great, and we really didn't want to be bothered. And it's true that on that road we made lots of enemies. I guess mainly I made lots of enemies. And the good thing is, when an old person like me made enemies, it really doesn't matter. What are they going to do to me? So, yes.
I understand that Rabbi Homolka has stepped down. I don't know if that's still the case, and I wonder if it is, if the successor.
What happened, that there was a bit of a fuss, more than a bit of a fuss. Some people complained about being treated too harshly, let's put it that way. And I'm sure that was justified, and justified on both sides. Homolka, who comes from a background, a very successful background, a commercial background, decided that he would encourage people to make decisions on their own, or to do so with minimal consultation, because most of that consultation, as in the case of a great many other boards, Jewish and non-Jewish, is a waste of time. It just postpones the decision to some extent. So Homolka, who is very efficient and was able to do, and who is also a rabbi, was able to do a great deal very quickly, and probably with a minimum of discussion. Probably a little too little. He realized that too. And so he stepped down as a president or leader or whatever it is of a half a dozen organizations, and they were reorganized. And he was out of that leadership. But that really didn't make terribly much difference because he's the kind of person that knows virtually everybody. So if you want to get something done, you can avoid him and not bother about him altogether. Or you can say, let me get his advice. Who should I really talk to? Who is going to be able to push this problem that we have, or who is going to stand in our way? So Homolka, by stepping out, stepped out officially, but unofficially is still more than willing to help us and to move us along with any problems that we have. So he also has become more willing to talk about any problems, discuss it, and so on, and then leave it be. So that's worked out quite well. And I'm sure that in this age, when you have to be very careful, no matter what your position is, and leave everybody room to talk, to discuss, to disagree, he has learned that lesson as well. And after a few sets of newspaper articles, peace has broken out, and we are functioning fine, and he's functioning fine, and he's quite willing to do it in that more moderate, democratic fashion. You know, he is a rabbi, but he's never had a congregation. So that kind of experience with the congregation and with the personalities which the congregation brings up has never been his. I can't say that he has missed terribly much, but it worked out fine. Yes? Many of the rabbis, have they worked in different congregations? Some people do serve multiple cities, but most of them end up serving one, and unless there's another one very close by that they can also serve without any difficulty. But we have more applicants than, put it this way, we could place more rabbis than we have, so we encourage people to continue to study for the rabbinate. And that has generally worked out quite well. Yes? Speak up. I still haven't heard it. Sorry. Thank you. Well, you know, both types are necessary. Those that are willing to listen to the student and say, you probably have studied this longer than I have, so what your thoughts are on this are important. Or what is the tendency, I think, anyhow, of Europeans is to make a decision and never mind democracy, and just go ahead with that. Yes? Sorry, I didn't. Oh yes, there is a cantorial program, which is quite good and which enables us to use the music schools in Berlin. So they combine that with, it's small, so, as a good musical voice is not part of my heritage. You just have to put up with my singing. They have done very well, but most congregations are unable to have both a rabbi and a cantor because the congregations by our sizes are very small. There's hardly anybody as big as this congregation there is nobody in Central Europe that's that size, anywhere even near that size. So what happens is that when we train them, they prefer, of course, to go to a congregation in Germany. But most of those pulpits are now filled. So they go to all the other neighboring countries. And again, for a European to learn another language and function pretty well rather quickly happens with fair ease. That's not true for Americans. We figure they should learn English, but the whole congregation isn't going to learn English for the sake of the rabbi. So that's just totally different in the approach. Well, I'm glad you came to hear a little bit about Geiger College and how it functions, and I hope that it will continue to be able to function as it has. And what's interesting to me is that we American students are quite willing to adapt to what is necessary to function in Europe. So thank you for coming. Enjoy the rest of the Yom Kippur. The beautiful Yom Kippur service with wonderful music, good sermons, and everything going extremely well. So I thank you.
Thank you, Rabbi. Thank you, Rabbi.
Oh, thank you, thank you.
Oh, your mic's still on.
Oh.